Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be looking at page 3 of our Intro to Models and Explanation packet. Alright, so here for experiment 1 our question is, does CO2 affect the rate of photosynthesis? Some of you did this in our LODIA lab where you actually tested it. Alright, by the way, here are the results as CO2 increases, the number of bubbles increased. Alright, so it looks like there was more photosynthesis happening. Our goal is to draw a model showing why this happened, what was going on that caused there to be more bubbles. And remember, the bubbles are oxygen in this case. All right. So here's our model. We have a low level of CO2 compared to a high level of CO2. Now a little bit more information. All right, there's a high amount of light and H2O present in both chambers, and these are held constant. So light and CO2, there's the same amount in both chambers. So that's important. Okay. So going back to what we've drawn already, right, here's our photosynthesis model. It's going to be a little bit more dynamic now where we could increase or decrease the amount of reactants and products. So I'm going to start off by just, where does this process happen? All right, it happens in the leaf, right? And in the leaf, a plant cell in the leaf. I'm going to draw a leaf here, right? And here are my reactants and products. So to start off, I'm just going to draw essentially my model that I have right here, right? Energy, CO2, water, glucose, remember, stays in the plant, and oxygen leaves. All right. And I might even I'm going to just do the same thing over here. CO2, H2O, and then glucose and oxygen right here. All right. And then remember, if they're reactants, they're going into the plant. If they're products, all right, we'll draw the arrows coming out of this process, all right? You don't have to draw anything here, but some students like to draw kind of like this cloud here showing, hey, this is the process of photosynthesis right here. Again, not necessarily, but sometimes helpful. And so we're gonna have oxygen that leaves this process of photosynthesis and glucose leaves the process as well, but it stays in the plant. So same thing right here. Okay. But now what we have to do is we have to explain these results, right? Where, okay, we have more CO2, or sorry, we're increasing the amount of CO2, high CO2, low CO2, and we're getting more bubbles. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, if we're getting more bubbles, remember those bubbles are oxygen. So in the high, let's say low level of CO2, maybe like right here, right, we're not getting too many bubbles. So, okay, maybe I'll just draw kind of a thin line like this. Right? But here at a high level of CO2, we have much more bubbles. So how could I represent in this model? Well, there's multiple ways that we could show that there's more oxygen. One way, all right, is to just draw a thicker line, right? That kind of implies, all right, we're getting more oxygen out of this process, all right? Now, all right, so here we have more oxygen. So we need to do a few other things too. So like, why do we have more oxygen? All right, if we go back to this example right here, all right, if we have more pancakes or more scraps, right, more products, they just didn't appear out of thin air. We had to have more reactants, right? So that's what we have to draw on the reactant side, right? So remember that there's already a high amount of light and H2O present. So I'm going to draw a high amount of H2O here and a high amount of light energy here. So a thicker line. All right. And because I have more oxygen, all right, you could think about it in terms of cooking, right? I could have a bunch of flour and plenty of heat, but if I don't have enough water, I'm not going to make enough pancakes. So I need a lot of every ingredient. And here it's the high CO2 level. So we know, all right, that we have to have a high amount of CO2, but also because so much oxygen was produced, we also know we have to have a high amount of CO2. All right. Now, even though we're not measuring the amount of glucose here, right, you can imagine that, let's say I've already eaten the pancakes, but the scraps are still out, right? By observing that I still have some scraps on the counter, and there's a lot of scraps, I know that there were a lot of pancakes made. So if I see a lot of oxygen, a lot of bubbles, even though I can't see the glucose, because I know this is part of the process, I know a lot of glucose was made too. So I'm going to draw a thicker line here to show that. All right, so let's compare that to the low CO2 level. All right. Remember, there was a high amount of CO2 and high amount of light and water present in both chambers, and they're held constant. So however I drew this arrow here for H2O, I have to draw the same thickness. Same thing with this energy here. Same amount of light, right? So same thickness. However, all right, there's a lower level of CO2. So I'm just going to just keep with my thin line right here. All right. So do I need to do anything here as well? Well, from our results, we know that we have a very low amount of oxygen bubbles, right? And that's kind of consistent with our model here, represented by the thin line. All right. And that makes sense too, because again, let's say the CO2 is the water. I could have plenty of flour, but if I don't have enough water, I'm not going to be able to fully make my pancakes. So even though we have a high amount of some of the ingredients of this process, some of the reactants, we don't have high amounts of CO2, and so we can't make a lot of glucose. We're not going to get a lot of oxygen, and we see that in our results right here. All right. So this would be an example of how we could use a model to either predict the results that we're going to get from an experiment or explain the results that we get from an experiment. Now, one other thing that I could do is I could maybe label this as the leaf if I need to. All right. Now, by the way, like I said, there's multiple ways to model this process. So let's just say, for instance, instead of doing the thick arrows, all right, you could have drawn maybe more oxygen, right? More glucose here, all right? More water, more CO2. And then here, more water and more energy, all right, but just less CO2. And because there's less CO2, less glucose, less oxygen. So there's multiple ways to represent the amounts, all right? Thanks for watching, everyone.